Thank you for joining me for another episode of Awaken Empowered TV. I'm your host, Ethan Fox. Today I'm joined by Rebecca Hardcastle Wright. We discuss a lot of very interesting topics, including the significance of Washington, D.C. and the different geography there, as well as how religious institutions and a lot of secret societies have influenced our current understanding of spiritual history, as well as the history of the United States and the world. We also discuss how individuals can raise their consciousness using different techniques and also heal their past traumas using things such as breath work or various technologies that are becoming available to us today. A lot of very interesting topics we discuss, so stay tuned for that in a few minutes. I want to also mention we have our Awaken Empowered Expo coming up here in Detroit, in Michigan, in the United States, on November 10th, 11th, and 12th, 2017. Some very fascinating topics and presenters there, including Michaela Sheldon, who's an intuitive channel. We have Caroline Corey, who will be here as well, Barbara Lamb, who is going to be speaking on crop circles this time. She was with us at the last expo as well. We also have Laurie McDonald, who is going to be speaking about the Mandela effect, and as well as what she's learned from her regression sessions as it pertains to extraterrestrial contact of her various case studies and clients. We've got Barbara Morey there, who's going to be doing an aura workshop, Ken Chorley teaching a workshop on telekinesis and aerokinesis, and a variety of other interesting topics and subject areas. Quite a variety of other presenters and experiences and sound immersion experiences as well as a number of exhibitors who will be at the event. So join us for that. You can buy tickets at awakenempoweredexpo.com. So we look forward to seeing you there. So without any further delay, here's my special guest, Rebecca Hardcastle Wright. Hi, Rebecca. Welcome to Awaken Empowered TV. It's really a pleasure to have you with me on the show today. And we have a lot of mutual contacts. And I know you've been, as you mentioned, on the show with Caroline Corey before on her documentary film. So thanks for joining me today. And where are you joining us from today?
In Phoenix, Arizona. I just moved here from Washington, D.C. just a few months ago.
I see. Yeah, I've heard you talk a lot about the interesting things in D.C., so we'll get into that in a few minutes. Well, tell me, so why the move to Phoenix?
I had lived in Phoenix before, and actually for about 20 years I lived in Phoenix. I grew up in West Virginia and Ohio, and then went to school a few different places, and settled back in Ohio and moved to Phoenix in '92, and then did a lot of awakening while I was in Phoenix, and as many people do with these fire energies here, things happen really fast, and people think they're going to move to Phoenix for this wonderful, new life, and all of a sudden everything comes up, and they're dealing with, a lot of personal issues that maybe were unresolved where they lived before, and that happened to me. And I lived here, and I began my work actually as a professional in ufology here. I taught ufology at Scottsdale Community College, one of the first ufology courses in the nation, and was part of an ET experiencer group here. But I am an experiencer since childhood, so it was kind of like a fruition for me to move here to Phoenix. And there's just such a strong and vibrant and healthy ET community here, and I published a book and was teaching and working as a professional as part of Michael Sala's Exopolitics Institute. And then one day I got a call and was asked if I would work for Dr. Edgar Mitchell's contract group. We were studying consciousness, zero-point energy, and the ET presence, kind of trying to integrate all of those ideas together, which is something that I'm actually doing today, some of. Not the zero-point energy as much, but more the consciousness and the ET presence. And so when I became a member of the team, the call went out, we need somebody in DC. And I seemed like the obvious choice because I have family both here and in Washington, DC, and my husband was from there. actually born in Washington, D.C. So we moved back there and lived there for 6 years. It was such a great experience of learning, great learning curve. A lot of things I didn't expect happened. A lot of things I did expect didn't happen. So it was that typical move somewhere, and there's a lot of surprises that go along with it. And then Edgar passed away, and I went deeper into my work with the Institute for Exoconsciousness, and DC was really changing and shifting, and I felt like my work there was done, and I came back here to DC, and it's just been, actually it's been a marvelous homecoming for me, and I'm very grateful for all the opportunities that have come with this move, and that's how I got back here.
Well, tell me about, you mentioned that you are an experiencer from childhood. Tell me about some of those experiences, and if I imagine there are a lot of them, but if maybe you can share one of the, or some of the more significant ones.
I consider myself quite a, quote, normal childhood experiencer. There are many of us who had ongoing communications with extraterrestrials, and that was a very definitive part of my childhood. My first memories are of around 3 years old, although recently I've had some recall back to what we call crib contacts. I don't know if you've heard of crib contacts, but that's really not that uncommon either, quite frankly. Great deal of people have had contacts with ET presences around their cribs. And but my primary memory focuses on 3 years old, and I went to star school at 3 years old and had ongoing ET contact as a child. As a child, we are very open, we're very trusting. Whatever our reality is presented as a child, we try to integrate it. So for me, my ET contact was always very easily integrated into who I was as a child. I didn't really analyze it very much. Things would happen to me. Beings would be in my room. I would go to star school. Things would be communicated to me. There was just this ongoing phenomenon around me as a child. And then around 6th grade, so kind of pre-adolescent, going into adolescent, I became aware that that I was very different, that my reality was very different, and I wasn't fitting in to my peer group. And I actually asked not to be contacted after that. And I really wasn't as much. And then I kind of proceeded with my life, and then my contact at different points picked up again. I'm a little bit different as a contactee in that I also not only went to star school, but I also went underground a lot, kind of like shaman traveling, I would describe it now as an adult. But I lived in a very small town in West Virginia called Clarksburg, West Virginia, settled by a lot of Scotch-Irish miners. We had a coal mine there, and the ground is very porous. Lots of kind of psychic Scotch-Irish people, hill people, mountain people lived in that area. And I have just vivid memories, not only of ETs, but also going under the ground and seeing actually extraterrestrial beings under the ground, and communicating with them, and then sort of this very vivid memory of kind of popping back up out of the ground. Once I'd been in the ground, then I would pop back up. And then later on, actually when I moved out to Phoenix the first time, I started to be aware that, I remember somebody gave me a book on shamans. I lived right next door to the Indian reservation, and in Arizona, which was interesting. And somebody gave me a book on shamans, and I'm reading this book, and I thought, oh my golly, like I've been doing shaman work ever since I was a small child. I mean, I came in doing underground work with energies, and I never questioned it or doubted it. It was just kind of part of my, I guess, psychic DNA. That's how I came in. But you know, it's really quite common among, you know, I suppose my ancestors probably all did that. You know, that's why they chose to live in West Virginia as opposed to other areas. There's a lot of isolation there.
So, what were these all a particular kind of extraterrestrial race, or just all different kinds of different races that you interacted with?
I've always considered myself to be a Heinz 57. Maybe that's because I came in to do work with ET experiencers like myself, and for us to form a community together. So I've always been aware that I communicated with many races, usually around 12 races I've communicated with as a child. There were, you know, small grays, there were certainly tall whites. I was around a lot of tall whites as a child. I was also around very kind of brown colored hooded beings. I was a child, I was around reptilian races, but they weren't really the frightful kind for me as a child. They always seemed kind of gentle. And then later on, I started working with mantis beings that kind of came at the same time with the whole orb phenomenon when I was an adult. At that point, then the mantis beings began to work with me. And I also worked with kind of mantis insectoid beings and Pleiadians and Syrians, and Arcturians, and many, many types of races. That's just been what was kind of part and parcel of who I was supposed to be in this world, is kind of an aggregator or a communicator or a connector of these races that many people have encounters with. And you know, later on we'll talk about the Institute for Exoconsciousness and the community of exoconsciousness that we're building that really dovetails my childhood and my experience with ETs.
So you went on to get some degrees, PhDs in some different areas. What's your educational background?
I was very fortunate. Well, I was very fortunate in my childhood. I was prepared as a scholar. My father got a PhD from Columbia when he was a young man, and my mother took postgraduate work at Columbia also. They met at a small college in Ohio that I then later attended. So I was always raised around very high level of intellectual learning. Books were very important, but my father really guided me to into more of a, I suppose I would say, a European type of education where you work with a mentor one-on-one. And I did that when I went to graduate school at Boston University. And I was able to read all of the, you know, philosophical and theological classics. My background was always philosophical theology, so I was part of that sector of learning. So I was very fortunate that I was able to have that kind of a deep background intellectually, and then I was able to study philosophy in Basel, Switzerland for a year. That was very exciting. That's why I was first exposed to Karl Jaspers and that whole Germanic sector of European continental philosophy. of the era, and then I went on to study phenomenologists and a more modern type of philosophy. And I'm still active somewhat in the American Philosophical Association and what they do. I actually presented Exoconsciousness at the American Philosophical Association, one of their seminars several years ago. That was a real interesting kind of encounter. I was sitting in this room with these academics, and I think it was in Baltimore. It was like back in 2000, probably 7 or 8. And I'm sitting in this room, and I'm going to present later in the morning. And there's these professors in front of me, and one professor looks at the other one and he goes, "Have you heard that some really weird woman's going to present about ETs?" And the other guy goes, "Yeah, I read that." And I kind of tapped on their shoulder and went, "Hi, that would be me," and introduced myself. So that was really fun. That was a very interesting experience for me, because I got up to present, and before I presented, I thought, okay, let's just get the lay of the land here. I'd written a paper, and it's been published in their philosophical journal. And I thought, okay, I'll just get the lay of the land. I'll just throw out some terms and ask if people recognize the terms. And it was amazing. No one could identify any terms I was using. They had absolutely no context, probably other than, Hollywood. And it was like speaking a foreign language. That's what it was. I was speaking a foreign language. And so what I ended up doing was just, they had my paper so they could read it. So I didn't really even get to present much of my paper because I was so busy kind of trying to fill people in of what this reality and what this segment of knowledge was actually all about. And I hope someday in the future I'll be able to do that. It was interesting because the philosopher I was presenting on was Carl Jaspers, and he was a medical doctor who later became a philosopher. And he dealt a lot with psychopathology. So he was always looking at, what's the psychopathology here? Or what is the mental illness here from a very psychiatric position? And he was one of the first persons that put together kind of a holistic view of philosophy and medicine. So it's interesting where my work is now, because now I'm looking at what is the psychology of contact? What happens to us, and how does contact change human behaviors? Why does it matter that we move from psychopathology, an analysis of psychopathology, into an analysis of psychology, into what I call in my work the exoconscious human? How have these different historical? I'm always very interested in not only the ideas and the concepts, but how those concepts were birthed, how they came to be known, and how that cyclical nature of knowledge kind of keeps weaving that thread throughout all of this knowledge, and how that relates to me as an ET experiencer, and how that relates to other people who may be contacted by ETs or UFOs, or near-death experiencers are quite similar to ET experiencers, or anybody that's had kind of an extraordinary type of experience. So to pick back up on the education, so I got a Master's of Divinity at Boston University School of Theology, and I became a chaplain at, this is funny, I became a chaplain at Wright State University in Dayton, Ohio, which is right next door to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. I don't know if you know Wright-Patterson, but that's where supposedly, well, factually, actually Project Blue Book. That was the home of Project Blue Book. That was the home of the Air Force Research and Development that housed all of the early years in the 50s, all of the early information about UFO craft. But it also supposedly, Hangar 18 has been talked about as whether or not the Roswell craft was brought back to Wright-Patterson. I don't know. That's still being investigated, but it was just interesting that, you know, I get plopped right down at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base on the outskirts of it. And so I worked there for a while. Another interesting piece of my life is that I became an ordained United Methodist minister after I received my master's as this chaplain. So I was functioning as an ecumenical chaplain. So I worked for 9 Protestant denominations. I teamed with the Catholics, and at that point, this is a new university built from the ground up for handicap accessible. So it was quite new at that juncture. And I also did all of the Jewish and all of the Muslim programming. So I was sort of kind of doing a little bit of everything. It was a really, really fun job. I loved it. But thinking back, you know, I started digging into the history of UFOs, and I started learning about Wright-Patterson Air Force Base and Project Paperclip. Project Paperclip, for your audience, I'm sure most of them know, but it's a program after World War II. Henry Kissinger was heavily involved in it, and it was the separation going into Germany and separating out the high-level scientists, some coming to America, some going to Soviet Union at that time, to Russia, and then who knows where the other ones went. But many of them went to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. There was a whole contingent that went to Wright-Patterson. So I'm going into freshman year of high school, and my family is moved from West Virginia to Dayton, Ohio. So I spent my high school years in Dayton, Ohio. So I got married later and came back, and that's why I came back there to be a chaplain. My husband was from Dayton. So my father is brought to Dayton, Ohio to serve in a German congregation that speaks German. So they have German services. And I've often thought there were a lot of engineers in it. I mean, Dayton was full of engineers and inventors. It was kind of like the early Silicon Valley, like the wartime Silicon Valley, you know, NCR, and you know, some of IBM was there. Just a lot of things happening there, and so it's like there I was in Dayton, Ohio, around these Germans, and I'm wondering, wow, you know, were they Project Paperclip people? I don't know, but I'm certainly kind of wondering if they were or not. So I went from there to Phoenix. I stayed, and I was married when I was a chaplain at Wright State University, and then I came out to Phoenix, and here in Phoenix I just was I was very fortunate in terms of education. I met a mentor named Dr. Ruth Hover, who was running had one of the longest running ET experiencer groups in the nation. And I just happened to move to the town where she lives. So for the first time in my life, I'm integrated into this absolutely wonderful ET experiencer group, where for the first time in my life, I get to talk to other people who are ET experiencers, because I had never been able to do that ever in my life that I can remember. So this was the first time that I really began not only integrating, but also accelerating my knowledge about who I am, what I know, what is out there for me to learn further. And Ruth was one of these people. She had a library that was 3 books deep. And when you go over and see her, she could like get behind the 3 books deep and find the book. That's how many books she had. So I just read like a crazy person. I was a single mother at that time and raising my 3 younger kids, and I was just like reading all the time. And and one day Ruth called me in and she goes, "You need to go get your doctorate." And I said, "Oh, I'm trying to get my kids out of high school, junior high and high school and into college. I don't know if that's really going to be on the agenda here at this point financially." And she goes, "You got to do it." So I actually went ahead and got my online degree in parapsychic science. So that was really good. And what that did for me, I just made a decision that I would begin to define clearly what exoconsciousness meant through my doctorate. And so that's just continued educationally for me.
For now, you started the term exoconsciousness. So for those viewers who are unfamiliar with your work, can you give us a definition of what exoconsciousness is?
Sure. Exoconsciousness is, initially I defined it as more of an academic term. I defined it as the extraterrestrial origins, dimensions, and abilities. Extraterrestrial origins, dimensions, and abilities of human consciousness. So what I was doing was looking at, consciousness as having these different classifications. What are the biological DNA kind of creation origins of our connection with ET within our consciousness? What are the different multi-dimensions of our consciousness, where like out of body and that sort of thing, where we can move into these other dimensions? Is that tied to our extraterrestrial connection, how we are connected to ETs? I also looked at, what are our psychic abilities and how are they connected to extraterrestrials, and the fact that we communicate telepathically with extraterrestrials, for example, or we have healing abilities that we do in conjunction with extraterrestrials. So I went down that path for quite some time and kept it very focused. That was really my first book. It's Exoconsciousness, Your 21st Century Mind. I kept it very focused on that kind of academic classification type research around consciousness. So for quite some time, I remained in the academic study of exoconsciousness. And then after I worked with Dr. Mitchell and began to work very closely with extraterrestrial experiencers as a community, I began to see that exoconsciousness was not just a study, but that it was more of a state of being, an ability that all humans have. So I began to define it as, I defined exoconsciousness as the innate human ability to connect and communicate with extraterrestrials. And I felt as though this really broadened the base of what we were talking about in terms of consciousness, that people were actually not just being researched and analyzed and diagnosed in terms of ET experience, but they were actually living an integrated and healthy extraterrestrial awareness throughout their lives. So that has become more of the platform that I'm working in today, where I'm still very interested in research and I'm very interested in the academic approach, but I'm also interested in kind of the future that individuals who do have ET experience, the kind of future that we can build together. For example, I'm writing a book right now called The Exoconscious Human Primer of Possible Futures. And what I'm looking at are 11 different kind of reality aspects of a reality that we could create as ET experiencers. What do we bring to the world? What do we bring to life? What do we live through in our life that is creating a new, not only a human with a new awareness, but also a human who creates a reality based on those awarenesses, and learning to live in harmony and peace and in a healthy, sane world.
Now, I've heard you say that a lot of our understanding and perception of extraterrestrial contact or UFO contact has been given to us by government and religions. So how does, or through mind control, whatever, and how does one know if they are really receiving extraterrestrial contact or if they're receiving some sort of mind control message?
Well, the primary method of mind control in terms of extraterrestrial awareness has been through MELABs, military kind of contactees. And often those contactees suffer quite a bit, dissociation or kind of artificially induced experiences. And they actually become aware of it, that this is what happened to them, and are very interested in finding out. Do you know Niara Isley? Do you know her?
No.
She wrote a book about her awakening. She was, I believe, she was in the Army or the Air Force, was some branch of the military, and she was given ET experiences, and she kind of dedicated herself to finding out what happened to her, and how that happened. In terms of people that were in military programs, like, do you know Cynthia Crawford?
Mm-hmm.
ET statues. I mean, Cynthia was literally conceived in a DNA kind of experiment, and had a lot of military issues around her. So those individuals, as they mature, find out for themselves, this is what happened to me, and they meet with other people that are researching that. Now, in terms of just general social engineering programs that roll out, once again, I think that you really have to start to get into the history of how government programs work, who they're aimed at, what are the belief systems that they impose on you as an individual, and is this healthy for me, is this not healthy for me? And a lot of information's come out of around mind control, but a lot of information still buried in the archives, probably over in Maryland, and will never see the light of day. So really, from the beginning of this modern era of, I would call it ufology as in the study of UFOs, from the modern era back, in the late 1940s, we had, a situation where the government took control as best they could of the phenomenon. And so what happened in that was a natural progression where people who had some kind of military background or scientific background began to take over all of the sourcing of UFOs. And so the government then either hid the sources or sometimes began to manipulate the sources of information. And so as a researcher, I began to see that your consciousness can't be continually exposed to only what the government or intelligence or the military or religion has to say about extraterrestrials. Because at that point, then you become that source. So you embody that source. That conditioning becomes so deep that that's all you ever see. And my my emphasis has always been that in exoconsciousness, we have to listen to the experiencers. And if you look at traditional ufology, historical ufology groups, including MUFON today, you very rarely have extraterrestrial experiencers included. They're always either in the back room or don't even attend. So you have a very slanted and I believe incorrect view of extraterrestrials. And when only the government, quote, inclusively, is defining ET, then you're going into whole, weaponizing of the message, weaponizing of the beings, all this attack and abduction scenarios, when in reality, that's not what most extraterrestrial experiencers live through. We live through a very different kind of reality than what the government is giving out. Just to indicate the extent, in DC, you really become aware of, I would say, the forces of power behind our country, and certainly, military, intelligence, banking, religion, in particular the Catholic Church, the Roman Catholic Church, those government, different government and banking sectors, those are the primary sectors. And when I have a talk I give about that, and kind of how the roots of that tree grew and what that means to us as ET experiencers. Because, for example, I do Google alerts for extraterrestrial, Google alerts where they'll send you all the articles about ET extraterrestrials, or all the articles about consciousness. You can Google alert anything. So I've done that for years, probably, I don't know, whenever Google Alerts was first founded. I heard about it and I got right on and started doing that. And I noticed, over the years, just this incredible control of information that was just coming out of the military and intelligence and government factions, as well as religious factions, and how it didn't ever correlate with what I was experiencing as an ET experiencer. And many of my friends who were ET experiencers, the whole community of us, was not experiencing that. And yet, of course, we were never on a Google alert. Our articles never made the Google alert. So I just really started to build and strengthen this community of ET experiencers, community of exoconscious, in order for us to share experiences and to share information, so that we may not be on Google alerts, but we have a method to get our information out there. I was at one of those DC dinner parties a few years ago. It's very small. There's like 5 people at dinner, and I was seated next to a person that was high up in intelligence at the time. And I knew he and his wife, and we'd been invited, my husband and I had been invited to dinner, and he was talking about, this was pre-Snowden. So he was talking about how hacking was such a big deal and everything was hacked. And I looked at him kind of quietly in the table, because it was a small group, and I just said, I said, that's really interesting, because I thought that you had, the early generation of quantum computers in your intelligence, and I didn't think that you could hack a quantum computer. And my husband was across the table, and he goes, Rebecca. And then he looked at the guy and he goes, she doesn't know what she's talking about. And the guy looked at me and my husband, and he goes, yes, she does, and she's right. And so I thought, okay, window of opportunity. So I leaned over to him and I just kind of quietly said, I'm right about something else. And he goes, oh, what's that? And I said, I'm right about the fact that the government and intelligence and the military completely control the message about extraterrestrials. and the extraterrestrial presence, and that you will decide how and when disclosure happens. And he looked over at me and he goes, yeah, you're right about that too. So that's kind of my take on where we're at with that kind of that matrix we're all living in.
I've seen your lecture about the interesting significance of Washington, D.C., its geography and connection to religious institutions and secret societies. Could you share some of the more interesting details from that?
Well, one of the things I was really interested in is in DC is the whole, not only just the Masonic, because I mean the Masonic presence is everywhere in Washington DC, and it just, you know, the layout of the city, the people who were active in Washington DC. I mean Francis Scott Key, who wrote, you know, the Star Spangled Banner, our national anthem, was a Mason, and there's just an enormous Masonic influence throughout Washington D.C. But the thing I was kind of surprised at was the power of the Catholics in Washington D.C. because, you know, America was really founded by the Puritans and the Pilgrims and you know, more of the English people who were coming, you know, across the waters, and kind of people who were sort of exposed to, you know, Martin Luther, priesthood of all believers, and, you know, it really wasn't the hierarchical Roman church. And so when I got to DC, I was just kind of stunned at the power that they have. Georgetown University is just heavily Jesuit, and, you know, now the Pope is a Jesuit. And it was funny, I went to a lecture by the Papal Nuncio. The Papal Nuncio is the embassy for the Roman Catholics, the embassy of the Vatican in DC. And he gave a really nice kind of talk about what was happening with Pope Francis, and he of course is also a Jesuit. And then at the end, I raised my hand, and I just asked about disclosure and the Pope and the extraterrestrial conferences, and you know, what the Pope thought about ET. And I mean, bless his heart, he was an elderly man to begin with, and he was just like, he was just fumbling around, and then finally he just said, well, none of that's true, and we don't really know anything about that. But I knew it was true, and I knew that all these things had happened with the Roman Catholic Church. And it was just an interesting sort of lack of communication. You started to see, oh, this level of church and government knows this, and the other levels obviously don't know anything about what's going on. So I used to be very open in Washington, D.C., and tell people what I did. And I can say, unfortunately, that hardly anybody was interested. It's such a very educated and, you know, kind of, it's incredibly connected town. Everybody knows everybody. I mean, I have never, it's almost like there is a communication network there that is bigger than anything I have ever lived through in my life. I mean, one of my daughters and her family lived there at one point, and she left town. And I mean, this just random person who didn't even know my daughter was like, oh, I heard your daughter left town. And I'm like, how'd you know my daughter left town? You know, how did you know that? And everybody knows everybody. That's the thing. I mean, when we watch what's unfolding today in politics in DC, it's like, I have to laugh. I mean, everybody knows everybody, and everybody covers for everybody, and everybody oftentimes lies for everybody. So it was just interesting that this kind of image that DC has of educated, progressive, liberal, it's a very democratic town, it's very liberal, that within that environment, absolutely no one was interested in extraterrestrial experiencers, period. And they were there was even much, there wasn't much more interest in disclosure or ufology. It was just not talked about. It wasn't on the radar. It didn't make their careers move. It didn't interest them. It was just very, it was a strange 6 years for me.
Is there any relevance to the fact that the Potomac runs through Washington, D.C., and is there a connection with that? And, for example, Giza having the Nile, is there some sort of spiritual potential that's given by a body of water running through a city that might give it more of a tendency toward having power and influence?
Oh, I think definitely. I think not only does it have, you know, a major artery of the Potomac River running through it that goes, you know, into the Atlantic Ocean, but it's also laid out like a diamond. I mean, it's purposefully laid out in these geometrics, diamonds, pentagons. When you walk around DC, there's female statues everywhere, angelic female statues. And so there's also a lot of springs there. There's springs coming up from the ground. And one of the things, like if you go to Jefferson's, Monticello, or whatever, like you see this, like University of Virginia in Charlottesville, like you'll see these little pavilions standing in the middle of an area, and then they'll have like a dome over top of them, and there'll be like a little concrete or, you know, boards or whatever, so you can sit in the area. So you can see them like on the Washington Mall. There's some of these also. Those are basically topping on top of active springs. I was especially interested in in a church in Washington, D.C. that I attended with my husband because I'd gone to seminary with the rector. He and I were friends from seminary, and so when I moved to Washington, he was like, "Oh, you know, come to Georgetown Episcopal. You know, you can meet people there." And I'm like, "Oh, that'd be great. You know, thank you." And my husband loves classical music, and they have a lot of classical music, and so that was a nice fit for us. But it's interesting, when I walked into the church, it was, and you sit in the pew, so like this is Church of England, Anglican, now Episcopal. When you sit in the church and you look up at the altar, there's no crucifix. There's a windows of 3 women. So you have it's called a triptych of the 3 Marys. So there's Mary Magdalene with the angel above her, and then the other 2 Marys on either side. That's what you look at. And then off to the left is the Virgin Mary with the baby Jesus walking out of a Vesica Pisces. This is the Vesica Pisces. At the top of the church is another Vesica Pisces. So all of this was very deliberate Masonic symbolism around religion. And the founder was, one of the founders was Francis Scott Key. So the Masonics built those churches. I mean, you go to National Cathedral, that was built probably with Masonic money, religious Masonic money.
I've heard you mention that a lot of the books and things that we've read, such as the Course in Miracles, are potentially manipulated. So can you talk about how you discovered that, and how is it that happened?
I discovered that because it was written at Columbia, where my father went, and it was written by a woman. I believe she was in the School of Medicine, working in the School of Medicine, and she began to channel all this information, and she the person who encouraged her to channel the information and the person who I believe helped transcribe the information also was a CIA person. So right away, I knew then that there was something else going on with that information. And I was also keenly aware of the fact that the CIA was also involved with early analysis of extraterrestrial experiencers. For example, Timothy Leary and the whole LSD experimentation. Timothy Leary was very connected to Terence McKenna, also very connected to CIA, you know, funded and having affiliations with them. And this is kind of like, people call it a rabbit hole, but I don't think it's a rabbit hole. I think it's just the history that we haven't been taught about who was really connected to whom and who was doing what work. Interestingly enough, I also became aware of the fact that John Mack was funded by, of course, the Rockefeller Initiative. You know, the Rockefellers funded John Mack, and that John Mack went to the Boston Psychoanalytic Institute, and he attended there. And that institute was actually founded by Henry Murray, who was one of the major founders of the mind control program, MK Ultra, here in the United States. And then Henry Murray later went over and headed up the Harvard clinical psychology program when John was at the School of Medicine in the psychiatric program. So I'm sure there, you know, continue to be crossovers between CIA funding and MK Ultra mind control programming. Where I went to school at Boston University at the School of Theology in the chapel. The chapel was actually the scene in the 60s of an LSD experiment with Timothy Leary. Came over and he brought some acid for Good Friday. For the Good Friday service, Timothy Leary brought some acid to run a program to see how the religious men of the time would react to it. So, you know, once you get into the whole, you know, the 1950s when Gordon Wasserman was bringing in the mushrooms and the LSD, you know, the chemicals for creating LSD, and humans were put into this really quite artificial drug initiation that had nothing to do with opening awareness that was done in, say, an indigenous culture, but that it was to actually cause people confusion, because drug taking, oftentimes, whether ayahuasca tea or whatever, it's oftentimes part of an indigenous culture, but it's done within a lot of boundaries and with a lot of care and with a lot of caution. And what we had in America was a deliberate misuse of these drugs. So, and not only that, but a deliberate misuse, I think, of channeling and selecting of messages that were broadcast. Also, during that same time, you know, the CIA was heavily involved in, you know, the 60s rock music. Dave McGowan's work in that is just totally enlightening. You'll never listen to rock music the same again after you read his work. And you know, when I met my husband, I remember it was so weird because he grew up in DC, grew up in a neighborhood where there were a lot of military and some intelligence people, and he'd go, oh yeah, I knew this guy in this band, and I knew this guy in this band. I'm like, Washington DC had bands? What? Doesn't make any sense. And sure enough, you know, it's like these were all children of the military that had a little garage band, and you know, the CIA came in and like, hey, I'm going to make you a star, and you know, you're going to go to California, and you know, it's all being run out of Laurel Canyon, and all being very orchestrated, engineered. The lyrics, you know, the Beatles at the same time with their connection to the Tavistock Institute, and our intelligence. Great connection with Tavistock Institute also. I mean, this is all an engineered reality that was not natural and organic, or it was engineered, quite frankly. And then we had the whole engineering of Eastern religion, and the Dalai Lama and his brother working for the CIA, and kind of the picking and choosing of what sectors of CIA information we were given about Eastern religion. And you know, when I talk to people that actually go to India or go to Tibet, their experience is so different than my Buddhist friends. There's no connection. They're very dramatically different connections. And I just began to see that once again, it was another engineered reality, and that the whole the confluences of Eastern, you know, an engineered Eastern religion with an engineered drug taking, and then an engineered channeling and an engineered messaging. And then, you know, the capstone for the whole thing was a concept, I don't know if you're familiar with it, called technocracy. Technocracy was developed once again at Columbia University in the early 20s and 30s by a group of men. And then when my father was at Columbia in the 40s, he was part of the School of Theology, Union Theological Seminary there at Columbia. And he lived in an apartment just below Paul Tillich, who was, you know, Paul Tillich in his later years spoke at Esalen. He was a very renowned German theologian and philosopher, and talked a lot about pop culture and the culture of religion, you know, God as grounded being, that sort of thing. And then I just recently went back and started seeing that, you know, holy moly, you know, he was part of the Frankfurt Institute, who was also connected to Tavistock, all these same ideas that came into technocracy. And that technocracy is unfolding right now. And a majority of my work right now is around who are we going to be as humans? Are we going to be roboticized? Are we going to be cyborgized? Are we going to be an artificial being? And I also began to see that a lot of this message was also coming out of Hollywood, that ET, experiencer, or ET equals cyborg, or ET equals robot, or ET equals a Star Wars, where we're going to have a war and we're going to kill everybody. And I'm like, wait a minute, wait a minute. That's not at all what my experience is, period. Nor every other ET experiencer that I'm around. That's not our experience. That's a Hollywood weaponized version of extraterrestrials. And now we have, you know, whistleblowers coming out of the government and, you know, kind of gaining overnight guru status, talking about all these, you know, programs that they're in, and they're jumping to Mars and whatever. And it's like all of a sudden, once again, it's like, you know, wait a minute. This isn't, once again, nobody ever wants to listen to the true extraterrestrial information from ET experiencers, who some of them are hybrids and ETs. So it's just become, I guess that's kind of the message that I've been working with recently, to see how all of these confluences of technocracy are literally coming to define our culture. And technocracy is an economy. It is not a politics. So technocracy is tied very closely to what we know of climate change, because technocracy wants to, the historical basis of technocracy is that it will create an economy based on energy. So the economy will be metriced according to energy. So what energy costs. So humans will be taken totally out of the equation. So there won't be any supply and demand or any other economic system that humans are involved in, much less human energy. It will all be a metric energy, kind of like cap and trade, Al Gore and Gorbachev's cap and trade on steroids.
Well, so much of our reality is created for us, then how do we know what kind of information in especially people watching a show like this are exposed to things like Course in Miracles and a lot of channeled material and so on? How does someone know what information to trust?
Well, I did the whole Course in Miracles. I mean, someone gave me Course in Miracles, and I was a single mom. I used to take my lunch hour and take my Course in Miracles book and sit there and eat my lunch and read my Course on Miracles. I've read Course on Miracles, every page of it. And I think that some of the information that Course on Miracles brought forth is accurate and it resonated with me, but some of it didn't. And then when I began to understand the true history of it, I began to say, wait a minute, we have to, there's a philosophy called Phenomenology. And what Phenomenology does is it began to bracket out certain aspects of an experience and to try to get to kind of the core of what the experience is. And that's what I think people have to do. I know people talk about, humans are being dumbed down and they don't know anything and the educational system isn't any good. But yet on the other side of that is independently, humans have got to get to the point where they can independently figure out this information for themselves and read the resources and see, does this resonate with me? Is this a truth for me or not? What exactly does this mean? Am I being manipulated by this information? Or is it really speaking to, the core of who I am? And that's why I think it's so important with teachers and parents that we share this information with our children so that they begin. I don't know, I was always raised in a home where if you didn't ask a question, then something was wrong with you. That you were just like, you were swallowing the catechism if you didn't ask any questions. So for me, I was always a questioner. I was raised to be a questioner. I raised my children to be that way. I think that that's first and foremost one of the important things. I'm sure the most important thing is to give them love and safety and a secure attachment to you and as a parent and your family, and to give them a safety. But it's also to say, this world is not what it appears to be. And you need to ask a lot of questions and not jump to conclusions. And for goodness sakes, don't follow some guru that's telling some phantasmagorical story just because they're in the Twitter feeds. So that's kind of that's my parenting philosophy.
So how do you think that these secret societies and government institutions gained all this power in the first place? I mean, there are a small handful of people in the world who control all the power and all the money. What do they possess that the rest of us don't, or did they just simply use certain spiritual practices to achieve that level of power? Do you have any thoughts on that?
I have a couple thoughts on that. First of all, just to go back to technocracy, technocracy works most effectively in a totalitarian state where very few have access to power. So I think that's what you're going to be seeing as technocracy rolls out in terms of a political system. I think that the whole invasion of privacy that's been given, free reign for the past, 15 or 20 years, that's moved to a level that probably none of us would have believed was really going to happen. That China is moving heavily into the AI market, artificial intelligence market. So you're going to be seeing more. That actually China is the perfect government for AI. So as long as AI is the high valued technocratic pathway, that's what you're going to be seeing. So the information, the metrics, all being governed by just a few people. Interestingly enough, in terms of secret societies, this is another really interesting thing I came about. I am a United Methodist. So the United Methodists were made up of the German Evangelical Church and the German United Brethren Church. The German United Brethren Church is an American church, and it was founded as part of the whole movement of abolitionists. So they were very much dedicated to ending slavery, to freedom, to liberty, to individual expression. It was an American church. One of the Evangelical and the United Brethren then combined with the Methodist Church, which was also had its roots in the Episcopal Church. So, because John Wesley, its founder, was from Church of England. So these three, Methodist, Evangelical, and United Brethren, all combined to become what we have today as the United Methodist Church. Now, interestingly enough, back to Dayton, Ohio, the Wright brothers lived in Dayton, Ohio, and of course, ushered in the whole historical era of flight in Dayton, Ohio from the back of their bicycle shop. I kind of lived near their bicycle shop. Their father was a United Brethren bishop, and he lived in Dayton at their home down in downtown Dayton near the bicycle shop, and he traveled around the country as a United Methodist bishop. Part of the United Brethren Church at the time was a policy against secret societies and the growth and proliferation at the time, at the turn of the century, of secret societies. Because there was a feeling within the United Brethren Church that this information needed to be accessible to all people, that secrets worked against freedom and liberty. And interestingly enough, and I've really tried to dig into this and get somebody to help me out, but I haven't really found anybody yet, so maybe somebody on here will hear this and give me some help. But it's my understanding from this research that I did find was that the Wright brothers family literally tore apart at one point the United Brethren Church over this issue. That a lot of the, quote, progressive, liberal Church of the Brethren members and leaders were highly opposed to his boundary and filter of this elite secret society information until finally he just failed, and they were able to then usher in an acceptance of secret societies. I imagine that this turn of the century historical event that the Wright brothers lived through, and this was very definitive in their life. I mean, they were very involved with their father's work and their father's faith. So it's kind of the untold Wright brothers story, I guess I would say, about secret societies. And it's just very interesting how I think secret societies have always been part of the Roman Catholic Church. I think that there's secret parts of Judaism. There's certain Kabbalah sects. There's certainly secret sects within Islam, within Hinduism. So it's just all around, how much these groups are allowed to proliferate with a foundation of secrecy. For me personally, a foundation of secrecy leads to nothing but abuse and trauma for other people. I really see no need whatsoever for it.
So I've heard you talk a lot about the morphogenic field and how the mind interfaces within consciousness and so on, and that's really the gist of the work that you're doing. So can we start with the foundation of what exactly is your perception of consciousness? Does consciousness reside within the brain, the physical brain, or is the brain really more of an antenna for this field of consciousness that is all around us?
I definitely believe that, and always have, that consciousness is a field. It's a field of energies. It's a field of frequencies that we resonate with or don't resonate with, that we can, as humans, I mean, it's really the foundation of exoconsciousness is quantum consciousness physics. That I believe that this field that we participate in this body with our brain and our body, I believe that consciousness within our body is not just our brain, but it is also our entire body has a consciousness to it, and that this consciousness that we experience on a sensory level is one of the ways that we integrate the psychic information or the quantum consciousness information from the field. Certainly, I ascribe to Rupert Sheldrake's morphogenic field, the research that he does and did. I subscribe to Edgar Mitchell's quantum hologram field of information. I think we're just beginning to know what consciousness is. I'm on an email list with a lot of different consciousness philosophers all over the world, and it's interesting. One man sent me a really interesting paper citing the fact that there's over 40 definitions of consciousness now. So that's quite a few. Another aspect of consciousness is, I like to tell this story. I was at yoga one day, and I left yoga, and I was walking downstairs with a woman. She looked to be maybe in her late 50s, and we'd been in class together, and of course I started asking questions, introduced myself, got friendly, and I just, it ends up that she works for DARPA, the defense research arm of the military that was founded the internet. I don't know, your audience probably knows about DARPA. It's a very interesting organization. It has no oversight whatsoever. It's allowed to go in and research whatever the military deems necessary to win a war, whatever needs to be brought forth on the battlefield to win the war. So DARPA brought forth sensor technology, the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The North Vietnamese were coming down the Ho Chi Minh Trail, and they wanted a way to track people come down the Ho Chi Minh Trail. So they began to develop, the first implements of sensor technology. But of course, any kind of technology you can hack. Everything's being hacked today, and the North Vietnamese hacked the sensor technology. So now, when we go on a freeway, that we have to pay a toll to go on the freeway, that's all paid for by sensor technology. So sensor technology is everywhere in our world, and that began as something for the battlefield. Once again, it also invented the ARPANET. DARPA invented ARPANET, which now today is of course our internet, and just a lot of game theory, artificial intelligence all goes into this whole field of technology. So she worked for DARPA, and I'm like, oh, what section of DARPA do you work for? And she said, oh, I work in artificial intelligence. And I said, I'm really interested in that, because I just read Annie Jacobson's book on DARPA, so I was really kind of a little bit up to date somewhat about it. And I said, what's happening with artificial technology? I've heard this, and this, and the algorithms, and the fact that it's going to replace all the jobs. And she laughed. She goes, I've been in that field for 30 years. And she goes, we're stuck. And I said, you're stuck? And she goes, yeah, we really haven't made any, other than deep learning, we really haven't made any major advances in artificial intelligence. And I'm like, I was kind of stunned. I'm like, wow, that's not what the paper says. That's not what I read on Facebook. And, it's not what goes into my Google News. It's, really quite the opposite. She goes, oh, no, no. She goes, it's 30 years. She goes, we're not really, there's a lot of hurdles to get across. And I said, is the hurdle because you don't understand consciousness? And she said, yeah, that's the hurdle. So I think as long as you're not only, the whole BRAIN initiative was instituted, the first BRAIN initiative, formal government BRAIN initiative, came about through George Bush Jr., I guess. George W. Bush, is that his name? He founded the whole first BRAIN initiative at the same time as the Genome Project. And by the way, interestingly enough, I used to live a block away from the Genome Project. God knows what they were doing. But hope it didn't get the groundwater. Anyway, so he founded that. Genome Project got somewhat of a success, even though that's really being exaggerated also. And the BRAIN initiative failed, and then Obama picked back up on the BRAIN initiative and tried to move it into Initiative 2025 and the BRAIN initiative and the whole implanting of humans and that sort of thing. So that is consciousness of the brain. And for me, that is a very algorithmic, technological, and quite simply limited view of consciousness. And as an ET experiencer, my intuition is it's not going to get you where you want to go. That until you begin to move out into the field of consciousness and understand what it is, then you're going to be handicapped. You're going to be, your propulsion systems, your communication systems are all going to be of a lower level. That's my opinion.
Is there really, and a lot of people who watch shows like this have concern over artificial intelligence, and a lot of the Hollywood movies that address those topics of robots taking over the world one day. Is there really such a threat? I mean, if everything is part of collective consciousness, do we need to concern about artificial intelligence going awry and turning against human beings if ultimately the whole collective consciousness and its own evolution is what determines the consciousness of everything?
Oh, I completely agree with what you're saying. And I also believe that we need to be very vigilant around what is put in our bodies and our minds and what is put into our children's, my grandchildren's body and minds. I know there's a group in DC called the Bureau of Standards and Technology. They did the whole investigation of 9/11. They were tasked with that, so we kind of know what we got from that. But one of their areas of research is polymers. So polymers are fabrics, and how fabrics are woven and what certain fabrics are. Now why are they studying polymers? That doesn't make any sense until all of a sudden I'm like, oh, they're studying polymers because that's connected to the fact that all of our clothing manufacturing is offshored now. So it's offshore, made in China or Vietnam or whatever. And so we're not making our own polymer clothing anymore. Do we know what goes on in those factories? No, we do not. Then I came upon the information that we actually have nanotechnology that moves into the fabric, can be sewn into the polymer fabric of our clothing, and it can go through our skin barrier and enter our body. So they could vaccinate you with an implant, or they could just give your grandchild some new jammies made in whatever country with the implants in them that then moves into your child's skin. Now, I'm I'm of the belief that as a person's consciousness raises, that they expel these implants. I mean, most ET experiencers that you talk to, they've expelled an implant or two. That these implants are not permanently in our bodies to that extent. I actually met a man once again at yoga who was part of the Bureau of Standards and Technologies, and he was in the polymer department, no less. And I said to him, "Oh my God, you're in the polymer department." He was like next to me in yoga, and afterwards we're talking. I'm like, "Oh my God, you're in the polymer department. That's just fascinating. You know, I heard this, that, and the other thing." And I kind of reviewed what I just was talking about with you. He was so funny. He put away his yoga mat. He looked at me and he goes, "Lady, I don't know who you are, but you're talking way above my pay grade, and I'm never talking to you again." I'm like, "Oh, whew. Did something sensitive?" So, you know, this is really going on. And I think it's fine to say that, you know, mass consciousness or universal consciousness or advanced consciousness is going to, you know, eventually be the road that we all take. But, you know, we're really in the meantime here. And, you know, I have kids and grandkids, and someday I'm going to have great grandkids. And I'm really concerned about the child that, you know, grows up today. And, you know, it's de rigueur that their pictures are posted on Facebook. And that, you know, Facebook is their reality. It's part of it. It's a real huge piece of their reality. And all of a sudden, you know, you have a situation where, you know, now Mark Zuckerberg says, you know, Facebook's going to be telepathic. Well, you know, you and I know all that means is Facebook's going to implant you. That you want to use Facebook, you get an implant. Now, whether or not Facebook will last long enough to get an implant, I guarantee there's going to be some kind of, quote, social media net that's going to implant people in order to access it. It's just like in India. You know, in India today, they're going to a cashless society. You have to have an implant to go to the bank. You know, corporations have implants to get in the door and use the printer of their corporations. So it's kind of like, sure, we can be aware and intend that advanced consciousness is the route that is going to bring us to this place of advanced consciousness. But, you know, in the meantime, there's a lot going on, and there's a lot going on that increases every day. And sure, you know, the government and the military is a propaganda machine. I mean, the military invented propaganda. I mean, they had a lot of practice at it. They had a lot more practice than I did. So sure, they make up stories. That's what they do. And intelligence too. I mean, government, intelligence, military, they make up propaganda, and we believe it. And I mean, a lot of it is just don't believe it. Question it and say, you know, wait a minute, this doesn't feel right to me. And yeah, I do think a lot of jobs will be gone. I think that that's a reality, and it's not just going to be people that flip hamburgers. It's going to be people with high level white collar jobs. It's going to be accountants. It's going to be lawyers, and certainly it's going to be doctors, because the first time you can take your cell phone and you can go visit your doctor online on your cell phone through an artificial intelligence app and get your diagnosis and your prescription for the convenience and less money, that's who you're going to go visit. You're not going to go see your doctor. So in a lot of these fields, I'm like, people are just, they are literally defaulting. And so I've just moved my research into, you know, what are the higher states of being human? You know, what can we teach our children? What can we bring to our communities and our schools and people we care about what it really means to be human? And to me, that means, you know, your brain is free of brain implants because you want to use your psychic ability. Your body is free of implants because you want to attune your body to highest frequency possible. And those are really all about love and compassion and peace and harmony. It's not about being a weapon or allowing someone to use your body as a weapon. I wouldn't tell that my daughter it's okay to go get raped. Why would I tell my granddaughter that it's okay to let your body be implanted and weaponized? I mean, which is worse? It's abuse. It's attack.
So it sounds like if you possess a certain amount of consciousness, you don't have to concern so much about mind control and those kinds of manipulations that are existing in more mainstream society. So now you mentioned, am I correct so far?
I think that's correct, but I think, we are a human community. So, as a parent and a grandparent, I care a lot about that. I care a lot about what people know about mind control and implants and, technocracy and different social engineering that has been, been artificially implemented into our culture. Yeah, I care about, I care about humans. I've always cared about humans. And I guess I've never been of the belief that as an ET experiencer that I have the right to just say, well, you humans just figure it out. Sorry about your bad luck. I'm certainly not going to ram the information down anyone's throat. But then again, I think we all have the responsibility to make that information accessible.
Now, you talk a lot about going to yoga. I assume you're talking about Kundalini yoga?
Oh, I did Kundalini for years. I like Kundalini a lot. There's actually a huge Kundalini community in Reston, Virginia. But now I just go to regular, I do, flow and whatever. Just whatever class I can get into. But I did Kundalini. I had a Kundalini teacher for a while. I really like it. I've always liked it.
Is there any connection between, well, I've heard you talk about how the breath of fire or the breathing is somehow connected to consciousness and connecting to this Akashic field or this morphogenic field around us. Can you share some of the references that you have found in ancient scriptures and teachings that are relevant to that?
I've just, I'm really not, I'm not a Hindu or a Buddhist or a yoga scholar, but, I read a lot in that literature. And I think every religion talks about breath. Every religion talks about the breath of life or Kundalini or, moving to, other dimensions of consciousness. That's the foundation of religion. I use it in my life every day, all day long. I intentionally breathe every day, all day long. It's interesting. I was in Hawaii, and the Hawaiians call us the shallow breathers because we breathe so shallow. The Anglos breathe so shallow. So I consider yoga and to be not only an enhancement for opening consciousness and opening these different, chakras in our body and Kundalini and different energies within our body. But I also worked and began to know a man named David Verselli here in Phoenix that traveled the world for 15 years looking at trauma and found that how other cultures around the world handled trauma was very different than how the Western world handled trauma because, the British culture or Germanic culture, stiff upper lip and, you're not allowed to express feelings and go to your room and, putting children in kind of this closed down state of a void of expression where they're not almost like a solitary confinement. They're not allowed to express their emotions. He found out that the countries that actually encouraged the wailing and the screaming and the spinning and the yoga and the shaking, that all of those cultures actually dissolved, helped all those actions dissolved and broke up trauma scars, because actually when we are traumatized, our brain bleeds and makes a scar.
And so what are some techniques, such as breath work, for example, that can help individuals to overcome these scars, or even emotional, psychological obstacles to living a more full, happy life, and maybe raising consciousness as well?
I work as a hypnotherapist coach. I work for I work with an alternative medicine doctor. He's actually an MD, but he's been in alternative medicine for over 20 years now. So we have it's a mind-body clinic in Scottsdale. We have just a wonderful healing community. So with my clients, we talk a lot about what trauma is, what happens in trauma. Trauma is very much part of accessing other dimensions, actually. A lot of psychologists, not a lot, but some psychologists are starting to study, what personality is predisposition to ET contact. What are the kind of the predispositions of that contactee ET experience or personality, and then what are the after effects? What happens to their body after they have contact? So that's kind of an area of research that I'm really interested in and invested in at this point. So with my clients, I definitely, if they've been traumatized, I send them to yoga. And if possible, I like to get them to yin yoga, Y-I-N, yin yoga, where they can hold the posture for a longer time and begin to break up those trauma scars. Because when you hold a posture for a long time, your body shakes. Your body shakes, your trauma scars begin to break up. I'm also an advocate of plant-based diets, in terms of allowing plants to heal our bodies in a very natural way. I certainly pay attention to eating clean food, as much as I can, without GMOs and any kind of agricultural engineering, of course. I also do, for me, as I work as a therapist, I also work with ETs when I work with my clients. And I've always done that. That always felt natural to me, like almost like I simultaneously am working with the client as well as accessing and working with extraterrestrial beings that bring me information. And sometimes if I get stuck with a client, I'll just say, whoa, I need some help. And almost always the help comes through, either by something the client says or by something that just comes into my mind. I work a lot with helping people just get in touch with their emotions, because a lot of times a trauma response is that you do shut down your emotions. So helping people compassionately and trying to do my best to help people feel emotions and recognize them and embrace them, as opposed to shutting them down. I also help people look at what happened in their childhood, because I believe one of my friends has been studying Bowlby, who was the person that kind of brought forth the idea of attachment therapy, that when we're born, we attach to a mother primarily, and we also attach to a father, and how those first 3 years of life where we're attaching and making that, that heart attachment with that parent or with someone who fills the role of a parent, that is so important and beneficial in our lives. And so I like to help people begin to look at, what was that attachment? How did it manifest in your life? And what were some of the conscious and unconscious messages that were given you that maybe are true, but oftentimes are not true? So we oftentimes very carefully and compassionately look at that kind of work. And then I also have the privilege of working with a technology-based trauma release therapy with the Gertis and brain states, which was a quantum-based technology that incorporated a lot of different spiritual modalities. And it's actually it's called brain optimization. It's available actually all over the world and certainly all over the United States. But it's technology of the brain, looks at the brain, and the brain heals itself. So it's the organ actually healing itself. We do a lot of hypnotherapy with people to access alternative states of consciousness. I believe that we can go, or I not only believe, but I practice that we can go into our bodies and talk to our bodies at a cellular level and access the information that brings up to us. I also have a colleague, Terry Sisley, that does exo healing, and so I have colleagues that work directly with extraterrestrials to heal and to open pathways of information. But for me, I really like the coaching modality. I was kind of trained as kind of a pastoral counselor, very classical, primarily Western psychological information and education. But today I really believe in the fact that each client I work with has the ability to access deep levels of who they are and who they're meant to be coming into this life. And so I like the coaching model because it kind of takes me, it gives me the opportunity to not tell people what to know, but to give them the space to come into the knowing. And I think for ET experiencers, and my journey has been that I needed to come into that knowing on my own. I read many books, I listened to many talks, I had many teachers, but what really came down to it was on a spiritual level and in a holistic level, I had to make that journey of getting that information and integrating it on my own, which for me, a lot of it was extraterrestrial experience. I believe that exoconscious humans, that there's a lot of us out there now that are really functioning at very high levels of personal integration, that we have integrated not only the experience of ET contact, but we've also integrated the information and the wisdom and the physical, emotional, mental, and spiritual transformations that happen to us, because it is a completely holistic change that happens to us.
Now, are you seeing any sort of positive forward momentum in the global leadership, Washington, D.C., or even the religious institutions toward a more open approach and with more high consciousness? Or are they pretty much stuck where they are in the direction they've been going?
Well, I think the reality of politics is, I kind of call it the payoff bubble. Everybody's paid off. And I think the same thing is operating in a lot of religion. I mean, the Vatican Bank is one of the world's, foremost banking institutions. I think that as long as you're operating on that monetary control factor, sure, you can act like you're evolved and you really care, but behind the scenes and in secret, you're rolling out social engineering programs, you're destroying families, you're destroying communities, you're invading human liberty and human privacy. And, it's all about money and power. I think, unfortunately, that's where they are. And that's fine. I think, that aspect, that level is probably going to be on Earth for a while yet. I don't think it's going to destroy everybody, but I think it's functioning. And certainly, you know, what's happening in Washington, D.C. now, you know, it's like everybody's pointing at everybody, you know, you're a spy, you're a spy, you're a spy. When, you know, the history is that, you know, everybody's been spying on everybody, and everybody's been affecting everybody's elections all over the world. So, you know, nobody's hands are clean, that's for sure. So I think it's, I know for the Institute for Exoconsciousness, for the community of Exoconscious, we're a grassroots organization. And I really don't believe in hierarchical structures, that someone has more power and knowledge and education than someone else. Personally, I just don't believe that. I don't believe it works. I don't believe it will work. And people in Washington, D.C. and in most major capitals of the world ascribe to that. They ascribe to, you know, they want to be on the top of the pyramid. So I think as long as you're in that kind of information system, that it's not really anything that I see will work. I mean, the field of consciousness is open to everybody. I mean, there are humans walking around on the earth that have very little of a brain, like very minor pieces of their brain even exist, and yet they're functioning just fine because they're functioning in the field of consciousness. I mean, these people have been known about for a long time. You know, you don't need a brain to function in consciousness. You just don't.
Is there any significance, do you think, to our current president of the United States, or is it really not matter because the people who are really making the rules are not voted into office anyway?
Absolutely, absolutely, categorically. I think what's happening now, and what I see, you know, if we look back in the early '90s, when the Soviet Union collapsed and Russia, you know, the country of Russia was kind of created, you know, Harvard and Wall Street went over and took over Russia. You know, they moved right in. There's, you know, stories about the money planes and, you know, movement of cash and resources. I mean, Russia is a very resource-rich country. I mean, we've been controlling aspects of Russia for an incredible number of years. So, you know, all of this is coming out now. Everybody's finger pointing, when the fact is most of the people in Washington, D.C. either directly participated in these programs, because, you know, they all come from, you know, elite East Coast institutions, or they know somebody that did, or they have a government contract that did. So that's what I see happening, and now everybody's finger pointing. I don't know. And once again, from the technocratic point of view, you keep everybody involved in the circus of politics, and then you overlay the new controls and the new technocratic implants and agendas. So I think that's probably part of actually what's going on now, unfortunately. So I think it's up to grassroots people. I think it's up to individuals. I mean, I think as a mother and a grandmother and a wife and, you know, a professional, that I have a lot of responsibility, and I think that we all have a lot of responsibility, and we need to get busy on a lot of different levels and educate ourselves. And if something resonates with you, go deeper into it, and if it doesn't, then don't go into it. So just use your own. You know, we have to raise our children to use their own intuition.
So do you think that we're really in the minority, right? People who are of a higher consciousness at this time anyway, and if the mainstream population is still very much under mind control, do we as a minority possess the power to overcome these influences that have control over all the money and power in the world? And do you see that that's actually making an impact of us moving toward a world of higher consciousness?
Well, I think when, you know, I'll be honest with you, it was very disturbing to me when I started finding out about the CIA infiltration of the university system. and these major think tanks like, the Frankfurt Institute and the Tavistock Institute and the Human Potential Institute, or whatever they're called, I don't know, they're like all over the place, that they really co-opted academic learning and took what we knew about psychology and what we were learning about what it means to be human and what human behavior meant, and instead of using that to enrich us as humans, it was turned against us and used as a weapon against us with programs like mind control and social engineering. Humans need to have an attachment to a parent and a mother and to feel safe, and so, well, let's just destroy the family, would be one example of that. So, there's been a deliberate destruction of culture. Now, in terms of how many people you need to make a difference, that's very debatable. I mean, I've heard a lot of very small numbers thrown around. In my counseling work and in my personal life, I hold myself to a standard of, if I'm aware of something, I'm not going to collude with it. If I'm aware that something is wrong, I'm not going to collude with it. So if I'm aware of a social engineering program, if I'm aware of an infiltration, if I'm aware of an economic or a system that's being rolled out by humans, I'm not going to collude with it. I'm not going to cooperate with it. I'm not going to give it life and energy. The path forward, I believe, so like my husband and I got rid of our television. We just felt like that was an energy that we did not want in our home. We changed our diet. We, whatever we feel is the healthiest way, that's the way we choose. So I believe that on different levels, whether it's diet or information about what's really going on, or if it's maybe people that are getting spiritual and opening themselves up to quantum consciousness and psychic abilities and spirituality, that there's a lot of people like us coming from a lot of different root systems into the same tree. And so it's always been my wish that ET experiencers and the information that we bring forward can get moved out into these other root systems. For example, if you're an ET experiencer and you see value in, say, a vegan community, you join a vegan community as an ET experiencer, as a vocal ET experiencer. If you're into certain types of yoga or spirituality or any kind of body work, you join that community as an ET experiencer. If you're into any kind of knowledge about what social engineering programs have been brought forward on this in our society, in our culture, you join those groups as an ET experiencer. And I think that's the thread for me and for my work that I can help weave into culture. That these different kind of consciousness, advanced consciousness groups that are all different root systems, that we all need to start sharing our information and owning who we are as members of those different groups. That's where I see it having the most power and influence, as opposed to trying to get somebody in Congress or the New York Times to print the story about us. I mean, really? Nobody even reads the New York Times anymore that I know of. So it's just kind of, the media, the mainstream media is gone to a great extent. I mean, they're still trying to be relevant. Universities, to a great extent, have been bought off. I mean, obviously. Here at ASU, we have swimming pools on top of dormitories. I mean, since when did going to college mean you had a swimming pool on top of your dormitory. I mean, so I think a lot of institutions that we used to hold value, that used to hold value and meaning for us, and that includes churches. You know, churches, you know, let's face it, for 400 years, after the Age of Enlightenment, you know, science took study of everything. The church took consciousness, did nothing with it. Nothing. For 400 years. They've addressed nothing about consciousness. So, you know, in my humble opinion, you know, I still try to open doors in religion because that's the root system I came in with. I respect that root system. But, you know, churches need to wake up. They're talking about one of the most important topics that's being discussed today, and they don't even discuss it. Period. So, you know, when you kind of bracket off universities and politics and banks and a lot of science, then quite frankly, you're left with yourself and what you can create. And maybe that's where we're supposed to be right now. I'm totally comfortable with it.
Now, I'm seeing from my experience and all the people I interact with that there is an acceleration happening in people's awakening, and it seems like so many people are starting to awaken and become and open up to a higher consciousness. Are you seeing that happening too?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And I think part of that is a lot of research that's coming out of quantum science right now, that it's making consciousness much more of a... I remember when I started in this field, when I started and created the concept of exoconsciousness, I remember people would come up to me and go, I can't even spell that word. Why are you using that? You can't brand that word. It's too hard to spell. And I'm like, that's the word. That's the word. And a lot of people dismiss me. I mean, I have a lot of friends and, you know, major players in ufology that were like, you know, get a grip. You know, what are you doing? But I just always knew. So, you know, in my lifetime here on Earth that I've lived so far, I mean, I've seen consciousness studies just literally catch fire. And I mean, University of Arizona in Tucson has a magnificent consciousness study program. And there, you know, Stuart Hameroff's there, and he works with Roger Penrose, and, you know, David Chalmers was there at one time. And, you know, people are really moving into the science and then, you know, then we have the practices of consciousness. I mean, you know, we have yoga, we have meditation, we have, you know, people that go, I don't know if you're familiar with it, but in Protestantism and Catholicism, there's a big movement to the contemplative life, and meaning you don't lead the contemplative life by going to a monastery and, you know, not talking to anybody and living in silence the rest of your life. You live a contemplative life that you share with other people who are living ordinary lives just like you are. So that's a very wide and growing movement right now that, you know, it's very similar to, you know, I don't know if you know Tara Reid. She ran a lot of the Buddhist studies in Washington, D.C. and had just she has a powerful meditation, Buddhist teaching ministry in Washington, D.C. And it's just grown by leaps and bounds. So, you know, contemplative life, meditation, yoga. I mean, when I moved to Phoenix, I was stunned at the number of people that were into exercise. I mean, from when I left 6 years ago to today, I mean, people are really into, you know, not necessarily egotistically into their body, but they want their body to be healthy. You know, they want to use their body, and they want to breathe, and they want to live life. So I think, yes, to answer your question, I think there's amazing things going on right now that we're all, you know, me and my friends and my colleagues and with whom I my work. I mean, we're all benefiting from it.
Well, it's been great having you on the show today. Can you share some of your information so that if anyone wants to get involved with your work or come see you at an event, that they'll know where to go?
Sure. My main website is exoconsciousness.com. And we are also, that's the Institute for Exoconsciousness, and we're also building a wonderful online community of the exoconscious, and that is exoconsciousness.org. And you can go on there, and we're actually just in the early stages of building a massive online community that's going to connect all of the ET experiencer groups all around the world. And so that's probably one of the most exciting things I've ever done in my life. I mean, I love to research, I love to write, I love to speak, but building this community is probably one of the more empowering things that I've ever done in my life. But you can also just Google me. I'm on Facebook and Google Plus and Twitter and LinkedIn. But it's, you know, you can look at Rebecca Hardcastle Wright, and you can find me there.
Great. Well, thank you, Rebecca, for spending some time with me today and sharing all of your knowledge and wisdom. And I look forward to having you on again in the future.
Hey, thanks, Ethan. Really, really fun. Thank you.
Thank you. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Wake and Empower TV with my special guest, Rebecca Hardcastle Wright. Join me next week as we speak with another incredible individual who's standing on the leading edge and changing the world.